Hello and welcome back. I'll be crafting some decorative Easter eggs today here on the Matt Jasa channel. I'll be using a larger 31mm rod for the base of the egg. I'm shaping up the ends for a punty attachment, which is a handle used to hold onto the glass. I like to have both areas very molten and connected inside the flame. This can help limit the amount of air trapped in between the connection. I'll hold and rotate in the same area to build up a thicker connection. And then I'll just pull that out a little bit to the desired thickness and hold it very straight in order to get a nice straight handle. That can be very important later as I start to lay down the lines on the egg. If the egg is tilted or off center, then the lines will be tilted and off center. But before I can get to the fun of coloring the eggs, I'll have to finish this handle and flame cut this rod in half. With a rod of this thickness, when you put it in the flame, you really have to commit to it. If you pull it back out of the flame after only a few seconds, you will get some cracking, at least around the outside layer. This is due to the phenomena of thermal expansion. You can learn more about this in my recent science video, Thermo Expando. And so glass generally does take a long time to melt, even more so with large pieces like these. You could gather up a smaller rod in case you don't have one of this size. However, you might mix in some small bubbles or imperfections as it's gathering up. Whereas here, most of the glass is protected underneath that outside layer. And so I just need to shape it a little bit into that classic egg shape. And if any imperfections do show up, I can just swipe them out real quick from the outside layer. I'll attach a punty to the back of the egg and remove a little bit of glass from the front so it doesn't get too large. I'll have to give the punty a little more time to solidify before I can melt off the other one, as large objects like these tend to stay molten a little longer. And now I've made objects around this size, but never specifically an egg. So this is a new one for me. But the shaping shouldn't be too difficult. I'll use heat and gravity. If I point the egg more towards the ceiling, it'll cause the glass to slump back and flatten out. Whereas if I point the egg more towards the floor, the glass will be pulled out and become more pointed. And then holding it center or level will cause it to gather up into a sphere. And so that's your three basic shapes: angular, flat, and spherical. Anything more complex with a lot of sharp angles, like a square or triangle, you're going to need a tool to push the glass around. But any shape you make it will always return back to a sphere if you rotate it level in the flame. And so I'll make this side I'm working on now the top side of the egg, the thinner side, instead of the bottom. Sometimes you have to change your plans and kind of go with the flow of how the glass is melting. So that other side looked great for a bottom. I figured why not make this the top, which I'm going to point down towards the floor to give it more of an angle. For another demonstration of these shaping techniques, you can check out my glass spinning top video. It's close to the same shape, just smaller. You can also make the size of these eggs smaller as well, in case you don't have a large enough torch. But now to grab the egg, I found the claw grabbers do work really well. I started with this method here to get that last punty mark, trying to avoid the prongs. But later on, I found you can just grab the egg halfway down. It holds pretty well. And now to get the egg back on the punty, You just do these steps of taking it off, but in reverse. This is actually a different egg here. I'm planning to make a few and experiment with different colors. Kind of see which ones work best. My first punty wasn't very on center, so I'm going to try it again on the bottom. As I mentioned before, this will be important for the first set of lines. I'll be demonstrating the wrap and rake technique. I'll be laying down lines parallel around the egg and then rake through the lines in a perpendicular direction. And so I'll start laying down my parallel lines now. I'm keeping the flame right in front of the rod and moving the egg around. And so the rod itself doesn't really move much at all. I'm also laying down some pretty thick lines for what is normally done with this technique. A lot of times they'll be done with thinner lines, sometimes even threads of glass. When I first started, I was practicing this technique to make pendants. And I just found if I would lay too much color down, things got a little bit too busy. And so I would utilize more of the negative space, the clear glass, to help contrast or highlight the pattern. But it's good to remember that these techniques are just basic guidelines. You're meant to take it and make it into something of your own design. And now with those lines laid, I'm going to switch over to raking. I'm going to preheat a wide area along the path to better help those horizontal lines bend as I'm raking down. And I'm using a glass rod here, but it's much more easily done with a metal tool, preferably one made out of tungsten for its high melting point. They do sell tungsten rakes specifically for this technique. And now I'm going to rake down 3 more times evenly around the egg, and then start raking back up in between those lines. This will bend the horizontal lines down and back up and should resemble something like a feather. Some might call this the feathering technique instead of wrap and rake, but I figured it'd be good to explain both just to give you more to work with. As I said before, you're always free to experiment with the techniques. Change them up to better suit your style. See what works for you. What I've personally found for this project was to avoid the lighter, more transparent colors. They're not really saturated enough to stand out once you have them fully melted in. You need to put them up to a strong light to see the pattern. So opaque colors, especially a solid white, looks really good. Black looks pretty good as well. However, it tends to block too much light coming into the egg, and so it's hard to see the patterns. And lastly, I do think this amber purple color does have a lot of potential. However, I can tell I'm already over reducing the color. And so I'll end up with more brownish yellow earthy tones than purples and blues. You can extend and correct the pattern a little bit at the end there, as I was doing, before fully melting it in, by just rotating it horizontally in the flame. And it will melt back into that spherical shape. If it gets too round, you can always point it down towards the floor and pull it out more into an egg shape. The lines are looking pretty well melted in. A good way to tell is by looking at the reflection of the light bulb or light strip in your studio. As you're rotating and that reflection of the bulb passes over the surface, any bumps or gaps will distort that reflection. And then depending on how distorted the reflection, you can tell how bad the imperfection is. And lastly, for safety, it is important to wait for it to stop glowing before you stare at it. That orange glow does emit a lot of UV light, which is the reason I wear the darkening face shield. But this is looking round enough. I'm afraid if I keep going, I'll keep reducing those colors even more and make it even more pale. I'll flame polish that last mark out of the bottom lens, and I'll get it in the kiln so we can check it out. So I'm really liking how the pattern turned out, the lines. I'm not seeing much purple. I might have had some better results working with some lower heat or higher oxygen. But now I know what to do better for my other eggs. This is just the first of many. As you come up with your own projects, the first design is just a rough draft. As you make more and get better with practice, then you can start updating the design and add your own style to it. For my next batch, I decided to leave the pattern in the middle a little less melted in to give it more of a tactile feel. I know when you do more outer layer work like this, people will often ask, is the color painted on? So being able to feel the pattern, I think better explains what it is. But then again, you never know, and that's okay, because I love answering your questions. So go ahead and leave a comment down below with a question, or if you just want to say hi. And don't forget to share this video. That way others can find the magical world of lampworking here on the Matt Jasa channel.